Winter had a way of quieting Wilderbrook, as if every sound were wrapped in wool before it reached the ear. That morning, snow sifted down in slow, thoughtful spirals, settling on the courthouse steps like a soft reminder that nothing, no matter how painful, could stay unchanged forever. I remember the pale light, the crisp bite of air, and the small figure climbing the stone stairs beside a dog whose loyalty seemed older than the town itself. Eloise walked as though the world pressed a hand against her shoulders. A child of only 7 winters, she carried a silence that felt ancient. Her braids were uneven, tied by gentle hands in the early dim. Her mother's.
Ow.
No doubt yet already loosening, as if the day itself tugged at their neatness. Beside her moved Cinder, the winter-coated shepherd assigned to protective duty. Though anyone with a soul could see, he followed the girl not by command but by devotion. His breath rose like smoke around his muzzle, and with each step he nudged her leg. A small reassurance that she was not crossing that threshold alone. Inside, warmth hummed through the radiators, but it was the kind that sat on the skin without ever reaching the bones. The courthouse smelled faintly of old pine benches, floor polish, and the cold dampness of wool coats thawing. People whispered before Eloise even reached the front. That was the nature of Wilderbrook news, spread like creek water, quietly, steadily finding every hollow. That's the Hart girl. Hasn't spoken in weeks. They say she won't look anyone in the eye. Poor creature. Poor mother. None of the murmurs carried cruelty. That was the trouble of it. Pity could feel just as heavy as judgment, especially to a child who understood more than she spoke. Mara Hart sat several rows forward, her fingers laced in her lap with a tension that seemed to hold her whole body together. She lifted her head when Eloise entered, offering a fragile smile, then tremulous but brave. She'd been brave for too long, and the effort clung to her like frost. Even from a distance, one could sense the guilt she wore. Guilt for letting Silas Dreger into their lives. Guilt for surviving the night he shattered their peace. Guilt for dragging her daughter into a courtroom where truth and fear would be forced to meet. And then there was Silas himself, shackled by the wrist, but wearing his smirk like a polished badge. His dark coat hung neatly over the back of his chair, as though this were a routine appointment rather than a hearing for violence and intimidation. He watched Eloise with a glint that made Cinder's hackles rise before the girl even sat down. The dog's low growl was barely audible, but Eloise felt it through her palm as she touched his head. She leaned into him, absorbing his steadiness, letting her fingers braid through the coarse fur that had soothed more nightmares than sleep ever had. At the front of the room, Judge Rowan Callister adjusted his reading glasses and looked out over the gathered faces. He was a man built from quiet moments, long winter walks, steady decisions, and the kind of grief a person learns to live beside rather than through. Some said he carried the memory of a lost daughter in his coat pocket like a folded photograph. I couldn't say for certain, but there was something in the way he watched Eloise carefully, sensitively, that spoke of recognition, not pity. When Rowan began the proceedings, his voice was soft and measured. The tone of a man who knew loudness didn't always signal strength. He addressed Eloise with warmth instead of expectation, asking simple questions, first her name, her age, whether she was comfortable. She answered none of them aloud. Cinder nudged her leg again when her breath trembled. Silas shifted in his seat with an indignant scoff. "This is pointless," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the nearest few to hear. Rowan's gaze lifted just slightly. Not sharp but firm enough to silence him. Mara attempted to speak next. Her voice cracked like ice under weight. She managed a few sentences, broken descriptions of the night. Silas cornered her, the threats he whispered, the bruises he left. But fear constricted her throat, and her words began dissolving into the cold air. She pressed a hand to her chest, searching for courage that seemed buried too deep to reach. Eloise watched her mother falter, watched the shame ripple through Mara's body, and something inside the little girl tightened. She had seen her mother cry long after she believed Eloise was asleep. She had seen her wash dishes with trembling hands, sew buttons with shaking fingers, stare out the window at dawn with an expression that asked for forgiveness from the world that had wronged her. Eloise had swallowed all of it, the fear, the helplessness. The anger and it lived now inside her tiny chest like a storm waiting for a door to open. Rowan paused the questioning. He leaned back slightly, studying the girl as though he could feel that storm pressing against her ribs. He did not push her. He simply gave her space in a room that demanded performance. Sometimes, silence is the loudest truth a person can offer. Cinder shifted his weight, brushing against her leg in their old familiar rhythm. When Eloise was a toddler, they had invented a secret gesture. 3 soft taps behind his ear meant danger. Protect. It had been a game then, a pretend signal for imaginary wolves in the woods. But after the night with Silas, the meaning changed. It became the language she trusted most. Now, in the stillness of the courtroom, Eloise lifted her trembling hand. 1 tap. Cinder's ears twitched. 2nd tap. The dog's muscles drew taut, like bowstrings pulled silently tight. 3rd tap. Cinder rose. Not aggressively, not with the fury of a trained attack dog, but with deliberate, controlled certainty. His body slid between Eloise and Silas, as though pulled by instinct older than memory. His gaze locked onto the man with an intensity that flushed the color from Silas's cheeks. The court clerk gasped. A woman in the 2nd row covered her mouth. Even Mara, fragile as she was, looked stunned by the sudden shift. Eloise kept her hand resting on Cinder's back, grounding herself, grounding him. Though her own heart pounded so loudly, she felt it echo in her teeth. Rowan stood slowly, his expression unreadable yet keen. "Miss Hart," he said gently, "did your dog just signal something?" Eloise did not nod. She did not shake her head. She simply tapped Cinder again 1, 2, 3 while staring at Silas with eyes that held more truth than words ever could. The tension in the room, coiled so tightly that even the snow against the windows seemed to pause its descent. Cinder's growl deepened, not fierce, but resolute. Silas opened his mouth to speak, but Rowan lifted a hand, silencing him with emotion so subtle it barely stirred the air. "Bailiff," Rowan said softly, "hold the defendant where he is." The bailiff moved closer. Silas stiffened. Rowan stepped down from the bench, his footsteps quiet, the kind of quiet that carried authority without harshness. He approached Eloise as though approaching a frightened bird. "It's all right," he murmured, kneeling to meet her eyes. "You don't need to speak. Just show me what's hurting you." Eloise swallowed, blinking against the tears that had been pressing for days. She lifted her hand with a tremor knot toward Rowan. Not toward her mother, but toward Cinder's collar, the fabric worn and familiar beneath her fingertips. With a tiny movement, she repeated the signal. 3 taps. This time, the entire room felt it. Cinder stepped farther forward, angling his head toward something near the radiator. Something Eloise had noticed earlier, but had been too frightened to understand. The dog sniffed, pawed once, then backed up with his ears flattened. Rowan's eyes sharpened. "Bailiff, check there." Swept across the courtroom as the man crouched, reaching behind the radiator. His hand emerged with something small and metallic, something blinking. A recording device. Someone in the gallery gasped. Someone else cursed under their breath. The hum of whispers blurred into a single startled murmur. Silas surged to his feet, but the bailiff was on him instantly. Rowan took the device with a grave steadiness. Examining the red lights still blinking like a heartbeat caught in the act, Eloise pressed her face into Cinder's fur. Clinging to the warmth of him, the dog leaned into her, steady and patient, as though bracing her against the storm she had just unleashed. Rowan raised his gaze, and in that moment, he no longer looked like a man defined by quiet sorrow. He looked like someone who knew exactly where truth lived, and exactly what to do with it. The blinking red light in Rowan Callister's palm pulsed like a second heartbeat, steady and incriminating. For a breathless span of seconds, no one in the courtroom dared to move. Snow tapped timidly against the tall windows. The only sound bold enough to exist in the hush that followed the discovery. Silas Dreger tried to wrench his arm away from the bailiff's grip, but the man tightened his hold. Let go of me, this is nothing but a child's enough, Rowan said, though his voice barely rose above a whisper. It carried the weight of mountains despite its softness. He passed the device to the bailiff, who handled it with cautious understanding. Rowan's gaze drifted back to Eloise, who clung to Cinder's fur as if it were the last warm thing remaining in the world. Mara stood and reached toward her daughter, but her hand faltered midair as if she feared she might shatter whatever fragile courage Eloise had found. Her breath trembled in her chest. "Honey, you saw that earlier, didn't you?" Her voice was thin but gentle, nearly breaking under the revelation that her child had noticed what she hadn't been able to. Eloise nodded once. Small, solemn, Rowan approached slowly, mindful of the space trauma demanded, mindful also of the protective canine stationed at the child's side. Cinder's ears flicked forward, alert yet calm, his instincts flickering like candlelight behind his eyes. "Eloise," Rowan murmured, "you did the right thing. You showed us something no one else saw. You helped your mother. And yourself." He paused, studying her expression. "Is there anything more you want to show me?" The girl's throat tensed, and for a moment, Rowan feared she might retreat into silence again. But Cinder nudged her knee, grounding her. Eloise lifted her hand, not to tap, but to point straight at Silas. It wasn't the bold accusation of a seasoned witness. It was the trembling bravery of a child who had finally named her fear. Mara inhaled sharply. Silas's eyes widened with a mixture of panic and fury. He jerked against the bailiff again, voice rising into something ugly and frantic. "She's lying. She's just a scared brat, you can't." Rowan raised a hand, and Silas fell silent as if pulled under ice. "Sit him down," Rowan instructed. When Silas was forced back into his seat, Rowan turned toward the courtroom clerk. "Play the recording." The bailiff pressed a button, and the speakers crackled softly before releasing a string of sounds into the room footsteps. A door closing, then Silas's voice, unmistakable and venomous. The threats were not shouted. They were calm, cold, deliberate. Every word dripped with a violence that needed no volume to terrify. Mara collapsed into her chair with her hands over her mouth. Tears blurred her vision, not because she hadn't known, but because now the world knew too. Her suffering was no longer hers alone to hold. Eloise shut her eyes, leaning into Cinder, who sat solemnly, as though he too felt the gravity of the recording. The dog's presence radiated a quiet strength that seemed to absorb the fear leaking from her fragile form. When the recording ended, silence swallowed the room again. But this silence was different. It wasn't born from uncertainty. It was the silence of truth sinking into place. Like the final puzzle piece snapping into its long-awaited home. Rowan looked at Silas, then at the jury, then at the specter of winter pressing its face against the window panes. "I've heard enough," he said softly. "And so, I believe, have we all?" The courtroom finally breathed again. The prosecutor exhaled a heavy sigh that fogged the air in front of him. The jurors exchanged looks of solemn agreement. Even the most skeptical townsfolk bowed their heads, chastened by the innocence they had doubted, the danger they had underestimated. The bailiff seized Silas fully now, pulling him to his feet. He squirmed, spit curses, fought against the inevitable. But nothing could shield him from the weight of the truth he himself had recorded as he was dragged toward the exit. Eloise opened her eyes and watched him go. Her expression was not triumphant. It was tired. Too tired for someone so young. But beneath that exhaustion, there was a flicker of fragile, glowing ember of relief. When Silas disappeared behind the heavy oak doors, Rowan knelt in front of Eloise again. "You saved your mother," he told her gently, "and yourself. That takes more courage than most grown people can ever claim." Eloise blinked, fresh tears clinging to her lashes. She reached out hesitantly, and Rowan offered his hand without hesitation. Her fingers curled around his, small and cold, and he held them with the tenderness of someone handling fragile glass. Mara hurried forward then, collapsing to her knees beside her daughter. She wrapped her arms around Eloise, careful not to dislodge Cinder, who sat calmly between them. "My brave girl," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "My brave little winter bird. I'm so sorry you had to carry this." Eloise rested her head against her mother's shoulder. and for the first time since the nightmare began, her body loosened. Her muscles softened, her breath deepened, and she allowed herself to be held. Rowan rose slowly, as though reluctant to disturb the delicate peace forming between mother and child. Yet he lingered near them, his presence steady as a tree trunk in snowfall. "We'll make sure you both are protected," he said. The promise carried the weight of a man who had failed someone once and refused to fail again. Outside, the snow was thicker now, swirling against the courthouse doors in soft gusts. When they finally stepped into the cold, the world felt different, not warmer, but clearer. The air carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke, comforting in its simplicity. Cinder led the way out, paws crunching over fresh powder. His breath puffed in little silver clouds. Eloise held tightly to his collar, walking with the uncertain balance of someone learning how to exist without fear's constant pull. Mara slipped, her hand around her daughter's shoulders. Rowan followed a step behind them, watching with a quiet protectiveness he did not voice. On the courthouse steps, townsfolk gathered in clusters, whispering yet again. But the tone had shifted. Curiosity had melted into respect. Pity had become admiration. Their eyes softened as Eloise passed, though she didn't look up to notice. A woman near the front murmured, "That child has more courage in her pinky than most of us do in our whole bodies." Another man added, "That dog's a hero." He saw everything. Eloise paused at the foot of the steps, her small boots sinking into the snow. She turned toward Rowan, who looked at her with gentle expectation. Her lips parted, shaping sound that carried the faint trembling of inexperience. "Mama, we're okay now." The words were barely more than a whisper, but in that moment, the entire town heard them. The air itself stilled to honor their quiet strength. Mara choked on a sob and hugged her daughter again. Rowan closed his eyes briefly, as if the release of that tiny sentence healed something old in him too. The snow continued falling, slow and luminous, settling in their hair, on their coats, on Cinder's fur. It felt like a blessing, a soft anointing of a family stitched back together by truth, courage, and the steadfast devotion of a dog who refused to let darkness win as they walked down the quiet street. Leaving the courthouse behind, the narrator's memory folds the moment into something soft and warm. Some truths. I've learned, do not shout. They come wrapped in small hands, trembling yet determined, carried forward by loyal hearts that refuse to abandon us. They arrive in winter, sometimes, when the world is stripped bare and honesty glows more brightly against the cold. And if this story found its way to the tender place in you, the place that still believes in courage born from love, then stay with us. For more whispered tales that warm the heart on cold nights, remember to subscribe.